For a couple of years, I've said two things. One, the Lions are not going to win the NFC, right, for the second year in a row on that. And two, and there's a compliment, is they're like the younger version of the 49ers. Really talented, very aggressive, not a quarterback that carries you, but they make up for it in other ways. Creative play calling, physical, tough, really tough place to play. Just, so many elements. But I thought what would keep them from winning the NFC, and this is a conversation we had going back to early 2023, and I almost looked wrong about it last year. And I do think they were capable of doing it last year. They didn't do it, but they're capable. But I think what bit them last year is, again, what kind of bit them this year. And I think you have to acknowledge what a great year they had despite the injuries. But they don't have an elite head coach, and they don't have an elite quarterback. What Brad Holmes, the general manager of the Lions, and Dan Campbell, the head coach, have done to make the Lions not only relevant, but one of the best teams in the league is really impressive, given the history of terribleness that the Lions have behind them. But that said, I think in a way they've kind of peaked. And what's different about them from the 49ers, because people say, like, well, Dan Campbell kicked Kyle Shanahan's ass a few weeks ago, so isn't he a better coach? There's two things that are different about the Lions and the 49ers, unfortunately. And I do think if Detroit had gotten to the Super Bowl last year or gotten to the Super Bowl this year, they would have been able to build off it more than now the pain 2 years of not even getting there. And the two things that are different is, as you have success and your team gets more expensive, even more is asked of your head coach. And if your head coach is not a play caller on offense or defense, he cannot directly affect the game as an OC or DC, then he better have an excellent quarterback, like a top-tier quarterback, and or be an excellent game manager, because those are the ways that the non-play calling coach can affect the game. Have a quarterback that you lean on, so you have that level of consistency, because OCs and DCs leave. They become head coaches. It's a brain drain that occurs when you have success. And it looks like it's going to happen with Detroit this year. But quarterbacks don't go. Elite quarterbacks stay put. So if you have an elite quarterback, I think that's why the Ravens are going to hang around and hang around and hang around as a contender every year. They have an elite quarterback. Their OC and DC can change. The head coach has been in these situations and succeeded many times. I know that Baltimore with Lamar doesn't have a great playoff track record, but I do think it's bound to change. The AFC is much more difficult than it. The NFC is the division where you should be able to, the conference where you should be able to do this stuff. But the Lions, they don't have that in Dan Campbell. And then the second thing they don't have that the Niners do is the confidence that comes from having put yourself in the Super Bowl. I think going to the NFC Championship game and losing the NFC Championship game is a long way from going to the Super Bowl and losing the Super Bowl. Even though it's just one game, and in the end, you both end up as losers. You don't win. I think that experience of the lead up to the Super Bowl, the pressure of the Super Bowl, the attention of the Super Bowl, playing in the Super Bowl, understanding what it feels like to play in the Super Bowl, I think that's all valuable stuff that your players can build on that experience. And that experience is very, very different than playing in a conference championship game. And so it's not to say that the Lions won't have chances again. It's not to say they can't get back in the mix. Aiden Hutchinson will come back, and maybe they'll be healthier next year. But remember, they're like 2 years behind the Niners in the cycle of your team getting more expensive. And as your team gets more expensive, there's really two things that you got to have, one of the two things: elite head coach or elite quarterback that can help elevate players that are younger, are not as expensive, because you had to let expensive guys go. And I think it's going to get a lot harder now for Detroit, and their big window was these last 2 years, and they've missed that window. Now, maybe they'll replace Ben Johnson with somebody great. Hell, their next defensive coordinator maybe will be better than Aaron Glenn. But I watching Dan Campbell's post-game press conference, and we've seen this post-game press conference before from Dan, and he's so likable, and he's such an easy guy to root for. And again, so many have tried and failed to make Detroit a respectable, winning operation, and he and Brad Holmes have done it. But there's also this over love for Dan Campbell, because the one thing people love They love accountability. Oh, accountability. Look how accountable he is. And I've said this for a few years. I've said this from the beginning. This is not some new take. I think it's great that Dan Campbell wears his emotions on his sleeve. I think it makes him relatable and lovable and authentic and all that stuff. I think he's real, and I like him for it. Love him for it. Everybody does. But I think people tend to really give a little too much credit, because what you really want is, I was wrong. I was wrong. I was wrong. People love hearing that because they think it's accountability. That's why people got mad. Myself, like when you block Hassan Reddick with a backup tight end and you get your quarterback hurt, you got to say maybe that's a bad play. People really want Kyle to say that. It would have been nice, but saying I was wrong over and over and over again is not a replacement for being right. And not calling a timeout with 12 men on the field on defense on 4th down and short in a 1-score game in the 4th quarter with the opponent going for it, it's inexcusable. And this is not, no coach is perfect at game management, but it was always a criticism of Andy Reid. Kyle Shanahan's been criticized. A lot of it fair. Like I think every single one of these guys, none of them are perfect at it, because it's really hard. And the same for Dan Campbell. And they have they get a lot of credit. We got a style. We stick to the style. Okay. It feels frenetic. Sometimes it feels more reckless and frenetic than a style. And coaches can evolve just like players can evolve. But you can get better at it. They can all get better at it. But this thing of like, well, you see how he said I was wrong. That's so. It is. I'm not saying it's not commendable to admit when you're wrong. It's just at some point you prefer to be right and go to the Super Bowl. And then the other part of it is, and I think the year that Jared Goff has had, the couple of years that Jared Goff, just first of all, being cast aside, beaten down by the Rams, and to be mentally tough enough to survive all of that and come back and be the quarterback that he is really impressive. I mean, Jared Goff is at the top of the list of guys that I root for and whose success I like. But if the OC is going to change and the quarterback, I think it's just going to be a really interesting year for Goff. Just like it'll be an interesting year for Jayden Daniels if Cliff were to leave, although I'd be surprised. The longer, Washington winning makes it more likely that Cliff is around, and the Lions losing makes it more likely that Ben Johnson is gone. Here's the other thing that was very interesting, because Schefter made a report, I think it was Sunday morning, about a GM candidate that the Raiders are interviewing that people think is the match with Ben Johnson. And for a guy, if you're going to be patient and wait around, the Raiders do not seem to be the obvious choice. But right now, all of the organizations that are looking for head coaches right now do not have good track record. The Saints are probably the best organization of the openings right now. But it feels a lot like Shanahan and Lynch. Not a lot. It feels a little like Shanahan and Lynch, potentially. Remember what happened before Kyle Shanahan got the Niner job and hired John Lynch. What happened was John Lynch was working for Fox as an analyst and called a Falcons playoff game and was blown away in his meeting with Kyle Shanahan. And it was part of what inspired him to reach out to Kyle and say, if you're looking for a GM, maybe I can be that guy. Well, I know the rules are different because Brady doesn't get to go into the team facility and all that, but Brady had the opportunity before calling the Lions-Washington game to talk to Ben Johnson. And I know the Raiders on paper look like, man, why would you take the Raider job over the Bears job? Or why would you take the Raider job over, maybe you could have had a better job last year, or stick around. If you're going to take the Raider job and you waited this long, take another job next year. But the difference is Tom. And if you're Ben Johnson, right? Ben Johnson's, he's probably Tom's age, maybe a little younger, right? It'd be one thing if it was a guy 20 years older. He's 38, so he's younger than Tom. So as far as Ben Johnson's concerned, he grew up. Tom Brady is the quarterback of his era. All right. Tom Brady is the quarterback of his era. He was a high school quarterback. Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was a high school quarterback as Tom Brady was coming into being a star in the NFL. And then he goes to college and he's a backup quarterback at North Carolina as Tom Brady is becoming an NFL star. So I think that's got to carry a lot of weight for him. At the beginning, you go back last year when Ben Johnson's turning jobs, you never would say the Raiders is the job he'll take. But I think Brady's presence, it just feels like things are moving in a direction that has Ben Johnson going to the Raiders, which is not on the surface what you would expect, but just understand the effect that Brady could have. And then this week, they got to spend time together before the game. And now they lose and he's available. So that meeting, that relationship is very fresh in both their minds. So major fork in the road for the Lions. Guy, why aren't you treating the Lions like their window is as open as you say the Niners window is? And it's for what I just said. If he loses both coaches or even one coach, Dan Campbell's job becomes harder. Jared Goff's job becomes harder. And, I'm not sure if they can overcome it. I think they can overcome it and win because they're good enough for that. And their talent's good enough. But overcome it and win the NFC? I don't think so.